Seniors Climate Action Network, or SCAN for short, is a group of citizens in Dunedin, New Zealand. We are concerned about the current lack of action to mitigate the impact of climate change. SCAN wants to leave behind a better legacy for our grandchildren than the one which is currently developing. In November 2021, we submitted a 49-page emissions reduction plan to the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment. Our submission puts forward the case for net zero emissions by 2030 in New Zealand because we need to mitigate the impact of climate change as soon as possible. Our submission provides a comprehensive list of actions that New Zealand should adopt to achieve this. For many New Zealanders, targeting net zero emissions by 2030 instead of by 2050 is a big ask. Our submissions provides a detailed argument backed up by evidence why we need to do this. We do not claim to be experts in climate change mitigation, nor experts on how to undertake a necessary transition. However, we have been careful to base our reasons for achieving net zero emissions by 2030 on reliable sources of information. This does not include publications in magazines, newspapers, and websites. Instead, we have based our reasons for net zero emissions by 2030 on the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed publications published in top-ranking international journals, and also reputable research organisations such as the International Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations. We have not relied on secondary sources. We have copies of each primary publication at hand, and our emissions reduction plan submission fully references these publications. A link for downloading our submission document is provided at the end of this video. The role of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the greenhouse gas effect was known over a century ago by scientists. Svante Arrhenius published a paper on climate change in a peer-reviewed international journal in 1896. A few years later, the general public was informed that burning fossil fuels adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which increases global warming. Here is an example of a New Zealand newspaper article published in the Rodney and Otamatea Times in 1912. A century later, virtually every nation in the world agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in the 2015 Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was adopted by a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. The target of the Paris Agreement was to hold the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Reductions would be undertaken in accordance with the best science and on the basis of equity. It was recognised that the less developed nations would require financial assistance from the well-developed nations. The Paris Agreement recognised that business as usual emissions of greenhouse gases has to be curbed. Adoption of a carbon budget was agreed upon. The budget is an annual reducing budget, the total size of which is represented by the area under the curve of projected reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. Unfortunately, there is a smoke and mirror difference between agreement by world leaders and actual action. Action by our world leaders to mitigate the impact of climate change have been repeatedly delayed until the next meeting. Meeting after meeting has resulted in a lot of hot air. Greta Thunberg has summarised these meetings as being blah, blah, blah. The COP26 meeting held in November 2021 was no different. Over the last 50 years, there have been over 34 climate conferences, a half-dozen major international climate agreements, and various scientists' warnings. Greenhouse gas emissions have continued to accumulate in the atmosphere unabated. Action to match the words have so far been a dismal failure. In 2019, New Zealand declared a climate emergency. As of November 2021, there has been so far no sweeping and rapid social change in New Zealand towards mitigating the impact of climate change. New Zealand's net zero carbon by 2050 policy essentially supports incremental adjustments to business as usual. Climate Action Tracker has published a November 2021 update. As of November, climate warming is 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In a best-case optimistic scenario, which assumes full implementation of all announced targets, our climate would be heading towards a 1.8 degrees Celsius and as high as 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100. More commitment is required to keep under 1.5 degrees Celsius. In a real-world action scenario based on current policies, our climate would be heading towards 2.7 degrees Celsius and as high as 3.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100. This scenario represents a severe existential threat to all life forms on Earth. Urgent action is now more than ever necessary, but the focus of world leaders is currently on COVID-19. The majority of people in many countries agree that climate change in the long term is as serious a crisis as COVID-19. However, focus of attention is on the short term and immediate impact of COVID-19. Climate change is not going to go away, and the longer we delay in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the more greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere and the more dire the impact of climate change becomes. Immediate action is required on both fronts. Our planet Earth has a carrying capacity which supports myriads of life forms in various ecosystems, including that of humans. The survival of humans depend on the survival of ecosystems and the life forms supported by those ecosystems. If we overshoot the carrying capacity of our ecosystems, then that carrying capacity degrades. Earth would no longer be able to support the same number of life forms, including that of humans. In 2009, Johan Rockstrom and colleagues identified 10 planetary boundaries which must not be exceeded in order to ensure a sustainable future for life on Earth. These boundaries are interlinked, and crossing certain biophysical thresholds can only but have disastrous consequences for humans and other life forms. Human activity has the potential to overshoot the threshold of all these planetary boundaries. Climate change is but only one of many boundaries of overshoot. Other planetary boundaries include ocean acidification, ozone depletion, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, freshwater use, deforestation, biodiversity loss, particle pollution, and chemical pollution. In 2015, Will Stephan and colleagues identified the extent that planetary boundaries are at risk. The zones of planetary boundaries which are safe are coloured green. Those subject to uncertain but increasing risk are coloured yellow, and those subject to high risk beyond uncertainty are coloured red. The safe thresholds of 3 of the planetary boundaries, genetic diversity, flows of phosphorus, and flows of nitrogen, have already been well exceeded. A critical boundary is phosphorus, which is essential as a nutrient for all life forms. Climate change is in a zone of uncertain increasing risk. Continued climate change will exacerbate the overshoot of several other planetary boundaries. In 2021, Mathis Wackernagle and colleagues researched the ecological footprint of humans and estimated that in 2020, the demand of humans on biological resources exceeded the amount that Earth's ecosystems produce by at least 56%. Moderate business as usual can only but further exceed our demands on biological resources. We need to rapidly reduce our demands. To do otherwise will result in degradation of the carrying capacity of biological resources upon which we rely on for our survival. For 10,000 years, the world population grew very slowly until 1800. The world population by then had reached almost 1 billion people. From then onwards, the rate of exponential growth increased. The doubling time of any entity which is growing exponentially is the time it takes to double in size. The doubling time is approximately 72 divided by the annual percentage rate of growth. For example, if a population is growing at an exponential rate of 2% per year, then the doubling time is 36 years. In 1803, the world population was 1 billion people. By the end of 1927, the world population had grown to 2 billion people, a doubling time of 124 years. By 1975, the world population had grown to 4 billion people, a doubling time of 48 years. The most rapid growth rate in the world population occurred in the 1950s and 1960s, peaking at 2.1% per year in 1971. From 1971 onwards, the world population growth rate started to decline. In recent years, we have been adding about 80 million people to the world population every year. The current world population in 2021 is 7.9 billion people. The United Nations Population Division expects the world population to level out at 10.9 billion by the end of this century. GDP is a measure of economic activity in an economy, both good and bad. GDP has grown exponentially since the start of the Industrial Revolution and the use of coal and steam engines. Growth in GDP accelerated with the discovery and drilling of oil fields in the late 1800s. GDP per capita has also grown exponentially since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The most rapid rate of growth in GDP per capita, shown in green, has been in the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. The rate of growth in the average world GDP per capita, shown in black, has been much slower. Economic growth has been possible due to the exploration, mining and drilling of fossil fuels. As much fossil fuel energy used from 1800 until 1990, a period of 190 years, was used over a 30-year period from 1990 until 2020. Advocates of economic growth currently target a continued economic growth rate of 3% per year. This exponential rate of growth would require the use of as much energy as has been used since 1800 until 2021 over the next 24 years. The increase in the rate of population growth from the 1950s to the 1970s was enabled by the Green Agricultural Revolution, when traditional farming practices were replaced by artificial fertilizers, pesticides and farm machinery. In 1971, Howard Odum pointed out that people were effectively eating oil as a result of the Green Agricultural Revolution. This is even more so the case today, with subsequent increases in the length of supply chains from the farm gate to the plate of each consumer, due to the increase in the globalization of food production. It is now well established that current climate change is a reality, due to emissions of additional greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activities. There are many different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Most of these emissions are the result of burning fossil fuels. Each link of a web of supply chains from the original sources of fossil fuels in the ground to the goods and services enjoyed by consumers involves additional greenhouse gas emissions which accumulate in the atmosphere. A tipping point in our climate system is a threshold which, if exceeded, leads to abrupt and large changes in the state of the system. Some of these changes can be irreversible. In 2008, Timothy Lenton and colleagues identified 9 tipping points. In 2018, Will Stephan and colleagues identified which tipping elements are most at risk. The Greenland ice sheet, Arctic summer sea ice, alpine glaciers, coral reefs, and West Antarctic ice sheets are already undergoing change, with a 1 degree Celsius increase in global warming above pre-industrial levels. Sea ice reflects more sunlight into outer space than uncovered water where sea ice used to be. With each melting of sea ice, the oceans absorb more heat, which increases the level of global warming. The melting of sea ice involves a positive feedback loop where the melting of sea ice results in an acceleration in the melting of more sea ice. Because different climate systems are connected, one system can have an impact on another. The arrows on the chart show the potential interactions among the tipping elements. Each increase in global warming risks a domino-like cascade where a series of tipping point thresholds are exceeded. An existential life-threatening tipping element is the thawing of permafrost. Tundra is located in a large treeless plain in the Arctic regions where the subsoil is frozen. This frozen subsoil, or permafrost, holds a vast amount of carbon accumulated from dead plants and animals over thousands of years. The units of carbon stock in the diagram are in petagrams. That is 1 gram multiplied by 10 to the power of 15. In other words, multiplied by 10 15 times. The atmosphere holds about 589 petagrams, and permafrost stores about 1,700 petagrams. There are many times more carbon locked in permafrost than is currently in the Earth's atmosphere. There is a side issue here. Carbon is also stored on the ground in the form of fossil fuel reserves. Gas reserves contain 383 to 1,134 petagrams. Oil reserves contain 173 to 264 petagrams, and coal reserves contain 446 to 541 petagrams. The carbon locked in these fossil fuels far exceed that of carbon in the atmosphere. A year before the 2015 Paris Agreement, Christophe McGlade and Paul Ekins cautioned that most of these fossil fuel reserves must stay in the ground. At the 2015 Paris Agreement, nations agreed to restrict the use of fossil fuels and keep within a carbon budget in order to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. But many countries have continued to explore for more reserves of fossil fuels. By doing so, these countries contravene the spirit of the 2015 Paris Agreement and use part of the agreed global carbon budget in exploration for more fossil fuels, which should be used to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and infrastructure. As the climate warms, permafrost begins to thaw. This brings microbes in the soil out of hibernation, allowing them to break down the organic carbon in the soil. This process releases carbon dioxide and, to a lesser extent, methane, which is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. There is already evidence of permafrost thawing. Large-scale thawing of permafrost would result in irreversible change in climate. The result would be a hothouse Earth where no life forms can survive. In their study of tipping elements at risk, Will Stephan and colleagues concluded, quote, "Our analysis suggests that the Earth system may be approaching a planetary threshold that could lock into a continuing rapid pathway towards much hotter conditions, hothouse Earth." Unquote. In 2021, the International Panel on Climate Change reported that global temperatures were likely to rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels over the next 2 decades. This would cause widespread devastation and more extreme weather. Only rapid and drastic reductions in greenhouse gases in this decade can prevent climate breakdown. Every fraction of a degree of further heating is likely to compound the accelerating effects of climate change. Climate change scientists have estimated the impact of climate change on food, water, ecosystems, extreme weather events, and the risk of abrupt and irreversible changes. Negative changes are coloured with an increasing intensity of red for each increase in global temperatures above pre-industrial levels. Neutral changes are coloured yellow, and positive changes are coloured green. These estimates are couched in terms of risk and probability because any field of science does not and cannot provide absolute certainty. All knowledge based on science is provisional. What distinguishes genuine science from pseudoscience is its willingness to allow evidence to confirm or challenge its theories. A strong pattern of climate science has developed over the last number of decades. With each increase in the understanding of our global climate systems, the more dire are the conclusions of climate scientists as to where our global climate system is currently heading due to insufficient action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In 2014, Nassim Taleb and colleagues summarised the Precautionary Principle as follows, quote, "The Precautionary Principle states that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing severe harm to the public domain, in other words, affecting general health or the environment globally, the action should not be taken in the absence of scientific near certainty about its safety. Under these conditions, the burden of proof about absence of harm falls on those proposing an action, not those opposing it." Unquote. The action of burning fossil fuels, accompanied by greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, falls well within the category of applying the precautionary principle because failure to cease burning fossil fuels sufficiently quickly would result in an existential threat to all forms of life on Earth. When confronted by a lack of absolute certainty, and especially when risks involve existential threats, the precautionary principle as adopted by the United Nations must be abided by all nations, including New Zealand. We have a choice to make here for the sake of the survival of our own species and all other species on Earth. The choice we have is either a hothouse Earth, where we are currently heading, or a stabilised Earth. Lack of absolute certainty must not be allowed to be an excuse for any further delays in necessary action to mitigate the impact of climate change. The longer we delay action, the greater is the risk of a hothouse Earth. In order to avoid the prospect of a hothouse Earth, we need to reduce and eliminate our use of fossil fuels as an energy source. But we are totally reliant on high-grade energy and materials for our survival. We have a choice here. Unless we are prepared to adopt a hunter-gatherer existence, we have no choice but to transition from fossil fuels to high-grade renewable energy and infrastructure. We first need to examine fossil fuels in some detail in order to better understand the nature of our true options. The production of an individual oil field typically follows that of an initial growth period, a plateau as set by the drilling company, and then a decline in the rate of production. In 1956, Marion King Hubbert, a geologist, developed what is now known as the Hubbert's curve, which predicted that the production of all oil fields in the United States would peak in 1970. His prediction was 1 year out. Hubbert based his prediction on the rate and scale of new oil field explorations and the production history of individual oil fields. The Hubbert curve predicts the peaking of production of oil fields when about half of the available oil field reserves have been produced. The rate of oil production subsequently declines. Energy and materials are required to explore and identify where the most concentrated forms of fossil fuels are located. The mining of materials in itself requires the use of energy. More energy is then required to construct the necessary plant and machines to extract the fossil fuels from the ground and to run the plant and machines. The reserves of fossil fuels on the ground which are extracted represent gross energy. Net energy, also known as a surplus, is what is left over for use after extraction. All forms of life require surplus energy to survive. For example, a cheetah chasing down a gazelle expends energy in doing so. A cheetah and its offspring survive for only so long as the energy provided by eating the gazelle exceeds the energy it has expended in catching the gazelle. The cheetah also requires more surplus energy for its own day-to-day metabolism and that of its cubs until its next catch. This would be bare subsistence living. A safety margin would be needed to avoid starvation when gazelles are difficult to catch. Early humans required surplus energy to sustain the basic requirements of food, clothing, shelter, tools, and weapons for hunting. We now make use of a much greater surplus of energy to sustain not only our basic requirements, but also our higher consumer level of life in the pursuit of happiness. Our greater surpluses of energy over time has enabled us to develop a higher level of technology. The result has been expanding complexes of buildings, infrastructure, plant, and machinery. To get energy for consumption requires capital created by energy to get energy, and also energy to get energy. The energy returned over energy invested, EROI, or EROI for short, and sometimes EROEI, is a ratio for describing a measure of the energy produced in relationship to the energy used to create it. The left-hand figure shows a high EROI economy, where the energy surplus available for the pursuit of happiness is of the same scale as that required for basic living. Over a large part of the 20th century, we have enjoyed a high EROI economy. The right-hand figure shows a low EROI economy where the energy surplus available for the pursuit of happiness is much less than that for basic living. The two figures are overly simplistic because the energy consumption for basic living is shown to be the same for both economies. What constitutes basic living is largely in the eye of the beholder when life is well above subsistence level. For example, in some developed nations, a family home of 200 square metres might be considered a normal standard. In New Zealand, during the 1970s, the size of a standard 3-bedroom house was 94 square metres. What is frivolous consumption in the pursuit of happiness is also largely in the eye of the beholder. The balance of surplus energy allocated for basic living and the pursuit of happiness can vary from one economy to another when the total surplus is the same. The level of technology that is possible in any economy is largely determined by the surplus energy left over after providing for basic living. In the 1970s and 1980s, net energy studies around the world were undertaken in response to the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, which resulted in a 4-fold increase in the price of petroleum. The New Zealand government funded several net energy studies under the umbrella of the New Zealand Energy Research and Development Corporation. Estimates of the EROI of alternative energy sources can vary widely depending on the boundaries of the study. There is an enormous difference between the net energy at the point of extraction, 90 megajoules at the boundary of extraction, compared to the remaining net energy of 20.5 megajoules as oil, remaining as consumer-ready fuel. The following EROI calculations are based on for every 100 megajoules of oil in the ground. At the point of extraction at the drilling rig, the energy return on energy invested is 100 megajoules divided by 10 megajoules, which is equal to an EROI ratio of 10 to 1. At the point of use at the petrol station after extraction, refining and transport to the petrol station, the energy returned on energy invested is equal to an EROI ratio of 2.38 to 1. Driving vehicles requires infrastructure for transport. The energy returned on energy invested to provide fuel for consumer-ready fuel, which takes into account the energy costs of providing infrastructure for transport, is equal to an EROI ratio of 1.26 to 1. When estimating an energy return on energy invested, it makes a big difference as to what boundary is applied. Each of the energy losses from the point of extraction of fossil fuels to the movement of vehicles are heat losses, and each burning of fossil fuels emits greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. The diagram we have here shows the net energy cliff, with net energy available for consumption as a percentage of gross energy plotted along the y-axis, and the energy returned on energy invested, EROI, plotted along the x-axis. All fossil fuels eventually peak in terms of the maximum rate of energy that can be produced over any 1 year. The net energy which can be produced each year after peaking subsequently declines over time. The net energy cliff is where the rate of decline rapidly increases after the EROI of the fossil fuel has declined to a ratio as low as 6:1. The energy returned on energy invested inevitably declines to a ratio of 1:1, where it takes as much energy to produce or procure energy as that produced. A rapid decline in net energy over time does not apply to renewables. Each photovoltaic panel and wind turbine is replaced at the end of their service life, and this replacement life cycle is taken into account when estimating their energy returned on energy invested. The longer the service life of photovoltaic panels and wind turbines, the greater is the EROI ratio and the percentage of gross energy returned. In 2021, Tom Murphy provided indicative energy return on energy invested ratios for a range of fossil fuels and renewables in his 481-page book titled Energy and Human Ambitions on a Finite Planet, Assessing and Adapting to Planetary Limits. The ratios are indicative because estimates of energy returned on energy invested vary depending on which boundaries are applied. Hydroelectric tops the ranking with an EROI ratio of 40:1 plus. There is limited remaining potential for large-scale hydroelectric in most countries. Some countries are blessed with a high percentage of electricity production supported by hydro dams. New Zealand is one of them. Oil shale has a lower EROI ratio than renewables, but, in terms of scale, has so far propped up increases in total net energy, while net energy provided by legacy forms of fossil fuels has declined. Pedro Prieto and Charles Hall have estimated the minimum energy return required for society to fulfill a hierarchy of needs and aspirations. It is extremely difficult to provide definitive estimates for each category of needs and aspirations of the hierarchy. However, what is clear is that each category further up the hierarchy requires a greater minimum energy return. The level of technology in any society is dependent on the extent of energy surpluses left over after the necessities of life have been satisfied. Going back through history, each culture and civilization achieved the pinnacle of the hierarchy, but not all citizens enjoyed the same lifestyle. Lifestyles for everyone in the past were much simpler than we enjoy now in the developed countries. We need to transition from fossil fuels to renewables, but the energy return of renewables will be less than that of fossil fuels in the 1970s when field oil peaked. The implications are that a lifestyle dependent on renewable energy and infrastructure could be simpler than what the well-developed nations enjoy now. Delanoy and colleagues have charted the history of oil liquids production from 1950 to 2021. Oil liquids include natural gas liquids, biofuels and shale. The energy of production is plotted along the y-axis and the date and years are plotted along the x-axis. Delanoy and colleagues have then projected oil liquids production based on the global shift model, which ignores carbon budgets required to mitigate the impact of fossil fuels. In other words, a continuation of current business as usual. The crossed hatch light yellow area at the top of the plotted areas represents the energy required to produce net energy. All stacked areas below this light yellow area represents net energy available at the point of extraction. The dark grey area at the bottom of the chart represents field oil. When field oil was drilled in 1950, it required about 1 unit of investment in energy to provide a return of 50 units of energy. In other words, an EROI ratio of 50:1. Net field oil peaked about 1979. The combination of net field oil and offshore drilling to 500 metres, coloured light grey, peaked about 2004. Offshore drilling to 2,000 metres, shale tight oil, oil sands, onshore natural gas and biofuel have allowed total net energy to increase until about 2020. According to Delanoy and colleagues, total net oil liquids will peak about 2024 and then continuously decline until 2050. Other sources of energy include coal, nuclear energy and renewables. Coal can be converted into a liquid form of fossil fuels, but any conversion involves losses in energy. Time has run out for expanding the use of nuclear energy. New nuclear power stations would be up and running after the next 2 most critical decades of transition and mitigation of climate change. We need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and infrastructure, and there is a common assumption by many that renewables can provide the same scale of net energy that fossil fuels have provided so far. In 2019, Simon Michaud challenged that assumption with a study of the minerals and metals required by renewables. The global reserves of metals as of 2018 needed by batteries to phase out global fossil fuels are coloured blue, and the metals needed are coloured yellow. Copper is currently not an immediate problem, but nickel, cobalt, lithium and graphite present serious problems. Global reserves of nickel, cobalt and lithium for batteries are simply not large enough to supply enough metals to scale up renewables to fully replace the global net energy currently provided by fossil fuels. Simon Michaud concluded that alternative materials will be needed for batteries. These include zinc, sodium sulfur and hydrogen fuel cells. In the diagram, abundant elements are coloured green, and those elements which pose a serious supply threat over the next 100 years are coloured red. The reserves of zinc present a serious supply threat over the next 100 years, while reserves of sodium and sulfur are abundant. There are risks involved with handling sodium and sulfurs due to the volatile nature of both reactants. Liquid sodium can become explosive when coming into contact with water in the atmosphere. Sodium-sulfur battery factories and installations that use them have been the site of several fires. Another drawback to sodium-sulfur batteries is the high operating temperature of 300 degrees Celsius, which is needed to liquefy the sodium. These high temperatures can damage the ceramic membrane separating the anode and cathode components of the battery and exacerbate the volatility of the reactants in the battery. Hydrogen, an abundant element coloured green, is highly flammable and can react explosively if not handled correctly. Hydrogen is an energy carrier and not a direct source of energy, because the production of hydrogen is about 65 to 80% efficient. In other words, it takes more energy to produce hydrogen than the energy contained in the hydrogen that has been produced. There are further energy losses in compression of hydrogen and loss of energy in a fuel cell when supplying energy to an electric motor to undertake the mechanical work of motion. Fuel cells are about 65% efficient in supplying the energy of hydrogen to an electric motor. Electric motors also have a loss in energy due to friction when used to undertake mechanical work of motion. 100% recycling of materials in an industrial society is impossible, and waste to the environment cannot be avoided. In nature, dispersal of minerals is essential to enable the sustainability of an ecosystem. Humans, on the other hand, require concentrations of materials, and that requires the use of energy. Higher recycling rates require progressively more energy, which ultimately limits the practical level of recycling. Only a few metals have a recycling rate of over 50%. According to the United Nations Environmental Programme, the current end-of-life recycling rate for iron and steel ranged from 70 to 90% in 2011. The recycling rate of 90% is one of the highest end-of-life recycling rates among all the metals used by industry. Assume that all metals have a recycling rate of 90%. After only 6 and 7 cycles of recycling, only 53% and then 48% of the original material is available for reuse. The current rates of recycling of many metals nowhere match 90%, and higher rates of recycling do not bode well for the long-term future, because higher rates of recycling require progressively more energy than lower rates. Some metals require more energy to recycle than other metals at any chosen rate of recycling. A balance of longevity in use and the rate of recycling is necessary to reduce the energy costs of keeping minerals and metals in use during each generation of the population. This balance needs to be weighed up against the energy costs of mining for new minerals and metals and the extent of their scarcity. The grades of mined minerals and metals have steadily decreased since the 1930s. Without extraordinary advances in mining and refining technology, the 10% of world energy consumption currently used for mineral extraction and processing would rise as lower grade and more remote deposits are mined. Very low concentrations of minerals and metals are too energy costly to concentrate for use. All minerals and metals which are mined and concentrated for use in our industrial society are ultimately dispersed to the environment when the energy costs of higher rates of recycling becomes prohibitive. The energy costs of recycling will eventually exceed that of mining low concentrations of metals and minerals still in the ground. Metals and minerals which are ultimately dispersed to the environment after use represents the loss of resources which cannot be used by future generations. If our species of humankind should continue to exist in the far distant future, then future levels of technology will inevitably decline due to the inability to concentrate dispersed minerals and metals. Our focus is on the shorter-term future, and especially the next number of decades, where our actions or lack of actions will largely determine the future of our children's grandchildren. Previous economic textbooks depicted the economy as being circular. These textbooks did not recognize or acknowledge the role of energy and materials which flows into the economy, and the unavoidable disposal of waste and heat which flows out. More recently, there are those who extol the virtues of a circular economy on the basis that high rates of recycling are possible. Yes, by all means, recycling of materials in our economy should be encouraged and promoted. But to refer to such an economy as being circular promotes the misconception that an economy can be like a perpetual motion machine. That is incorrect. In any economy, materials and high-grade energy flow in from the environment, and unavoidable waste and low-grade heat flow out into the environment. Waste is unavoidable in an industrial economy. If we want to continue with an industrial economy, we need to ensure that our waste can be assimilated by the environment and does not overload it. The scale of waste into the environment will depend on the scale of our populations. When the true boundary of an economy, the environment, is taken into account, it is clear that the true nature of an economy is linear and not circular. Proponents of what has been named green growth argue that technological progress and structural change will enable a decoupling of natural resource consumption and environmental impacts from economic growth. In 2019, Timothy Parikh debunked the extent that decoupling has taken place in some countries in a comprehensive 872-page publication. Many claims did not take into account the embodied energy of goods imported from another country. Relative decoupling of GDP from energy and materials is possible, but there is a limit as to how much is possible. For example, it is possible to use less energy and materials more efficiently to provide goods and services. Recycling helps to reduce the use of additional materials, but there are thermodynamic upper limits to the possible efficiencies of both energy use and recycling. With improved technology, we have already closely approached many of these upper limits. Photovoltaic panels and wind turbines are good examples. Improvements in energy efficiency do not necessarily lead to reductions in the use of energy due to the rebound effect, also known as the Jevons paradox. The rebound effect occurs when greater efficiency in the use of resources results in greater consumption of that resource due to an increasing demand. An example is the increase in the efficiency of the steam engine in the 1800s, which resulted in a greater demand for more steam engines. Although each new improved steam engine used less coal, The combination of more steam engines using less coal resulted in a greater consumption of coal. The rebound effect can take place when demand is unrestricted, such as in a growth economy. Steve Keen has plotted annual changes in world energy and world GDP since 1970. The percentage change per year is plotted along the y-axis and the date in years are plotted along the x-axis. There is undoubtedly a close visual relationship between annual changes in world energy and world GDP. The correlation coefficient of these changes is a high 0.83. The reason why is because any form of activity or process requires the use of energy and materials. Any claims of absolute decoupling of energy and materials from an economy are absolute nonsense. Claims of absolute decoupling are on a par with claims of the possibility and existence of a perpetual motion machine. In 1977, William Opels cautioned that the time for concern about the potential exhaustion of a resource comes when no more than 10% of the total has been used up. This applies especially when the rate of extraction of resource is exponential. There is an expression of "don't eat your seed corn," which refers to the age-old farmer's strategy of saving some of the harvest of the current year as the seeds for the next. Our main energy sources have been fossil fuels, and they have produced very few seeds for the next harvest in the form of renewables. The inevitable peaking of fossil fuels has been ignored since cautions in the 1970s to make wise use of a proportion of fossil fuels to enable a smooth transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and infrastructure. We now have a situation where the energy provided by the current limited scale of renewables, such as photovoltaic panels and wind turbines, is insufficient to bootstrap the manufacturing of more renewables. Manufacturing of renewable energy sources requires the use of fossil fuels. The longer we delay in using what remains of net energy provided by oil liquids, the less likely we will be able to make a transition to renewables. At the same time that we should be transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, we also need to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels to mitigate the impact of climate change. We have a double whammy here. The only way out of our predicament is to divert the use of fossil fuels away from unnecessary consumption to that of investment in renewables and infrastructure, and do this on a reducing carbon budget to ensure we mitigate the impact of climate change. In 1971, John Holdren and Paul Ehrlich provided a broad brush measure of the impact of human activity on the environment in the form of an equation where impact equals the level of the population multiplied by the level of affluence multiplied by the level of technology. As mentioned already, the current world population in 2021 is 7.9 billion people. Population growth still remains the elephant in the room. It is a taboo subject, and it is politically incorrect to suggest that any country should limit the size of its population. For some people, the right to have as many children as you want is sacrosanct. Even if all countries were to adopt a zero population growth policy overnight, an average of 2 children per family, the world population would continue to grow due to inbuilt population momentum. The United Nations Population Division expects the world population to level out at 10.9 billion people by the end of the century. There are no guarantees this will happen. Population growth is not on the agenda, and continued population growth is inevitable unless war and/or nature intervenes. A measure of affluence is the consumption of energy and materials per capita, and GDP is a good proxy of consumption. GDP per capita has been increasing exponentially, especially in the world-developed countries. The impact of technology on the environment has undoubtedly increased in parallel with increases in consumption. Increases in pollution is just one of many examples. Given that the world population will continue to increase over the next number of critical decades, the only way we can mitigate the impact of climate change and avoid exceeding planetary boundaries is by reducing our current levels of consumption and the impact of our technology on the environment. In a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and infrastructure and beyond, we need to live within our planetary boundaries. It is imperative that we target zero population growth as soon as possible. Otherwise, all our efforts will be in vain. We need to reduce our levels of consumption, especially in the well-developed countries. We also need to adopt benign technology, which has a lower impact on the environment. The level of unavoidable waste we generate needs to be such that it can be safely assimilated by the environment. Reducing consumption levels applies especially to the well-developed countries. Carbon dioxide emissions are a good proxy for consumption of fossil fuels used to provide goods and services. The mushroom figure shows that the richest 10% of people in the world, and that includes New Zealanders, are responsible for 49% of carbon dioxide emissions. The poorest 50% of people in the world are responsible for only about 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions. An immediate 50% reduction in emissions by the richest 10% in the world would reduce global emissions to 75% of current levels. A 75% reduction would reduce global emissions to 62.5% of current levels. Happiness and satisfaction with life for people within each country is plotted along the y-axis, ranging from 30% to 100% of the population, with GNP plotted along the x-axis in United States 1995 dollars. About 88% of New Zealanders are happy and satisfied with life, with a GNP per capita of about $16,000, compared to about 90% of those in the United States with a GNP per capita of about $27,000. About 78% of Brazilians are happy and satisfied with life, with a GNP per capita of about only $3,000, which is about 11% of the average GNP per capita in the United States. Don't forget that inequity of GNP per capita between countries also exists within countries. The small percentage of extremely rich people in each country raises the average or mean GNP per capita above that enjoyed by 50% of the country. Many people in each country on less income than the average for that country are nonetheless happy and satisfied with their lives. Several studies reveal that once people are above a minimum threshold of income, happiness and satisfaction with life does not necessarily improve to any greater extent with substantial increases in GNP or GDP per capita. It is possible to have happiness and satisfaction with life on an income lower than the average for that country. A dramatic reduction in consumption by the rich countries will not necessarily result in a dramatic decline in welfare and happiness, but a transition to a less materialistic lifestyle will be difficult for some. Many of the actions recommended by SCAN to mitigate the impact of climate change and reduce our impact on the environment will improve the quality of life for families and enhance and promote a greater sense of community. It is as communities we will continue to thrive. Part and parcel of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy and infrastructure is the need to reassess the basis and purpose of our economy. The ultimate purpose of our economy is the well-being of current and future generations. Continued growth in built capital and populations is unnecessary to achieve this. Attempts to continue to grow can only but accelerate the same dire consequences that we currently face. To attain well-being of all generations, both current and future, we need to look after the primary basis of our economy, which is natural capital. From now onwards, we must be responsible stewards of all natural capital. Well-being follows on by looking after and preserving the primary basis of our economy. In summary, we currently face a wicked problem that has no easy solution. We need to reduce our use of fossil fuels so as to mitigate the impact of climate change and avoid the risk of triggering tipping points, which would result in an irreversible cascade of climate change leading to a hothouse Earth. We are currently totally reliant on high-grade energy for our survival, so we need to transition from fossil fuels to high-grade renewable energy and infrastructure. High-grade renewables cannot bootstrap themselves into existence, so we need to continue using fossil fuels to manufacture renewables such as photovoltaic panels and wind turbines. Reducing our use of fossil fuels is imperative in order to mitigate the impact of climate change. We have no choice but to divert use of fossil fuels on a limited and reducing budget from unnecessary and frivolous consumption to investments in renewables and infrastructure. This applies especially to the well-developed countries like New Zealand. Renewable energy cannot scale up to the same energy levels per capita that we currently enjoy in the well-developed countries. We will need to learn how to live well on a much reduced budget of energy during and after a transition from fossil fuels to renewables. It is possible to do this because much of our current consumption of energy in the form of goods and services does not lead to greater well-being. It is as supportive communities that we can continue to thrive. What is possible will not happen unless we face up to realities and respond to the urgent need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions without delay. We need to adopt the Precautionary Principle and target net zero emissions by 2030 instead of by 2050. The longer we delay, the greater will be the accumulations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the subsequent increasing risk of irreversible climate change.